All right, we are recording. So before we get going tonight we're going to be talking about PHP. I wanted to share some stuff. And I got to figure out, here it is. Okay, so the first thing, remember how I said that PHP was kind of tanking over time and that Python's on the rise? I want to give you the counter argument to why PHP is still a valuable language to know. And it is this. This article is just from last year. So this is not a super old article. It's like a little over a year old. And here is the stat. The number is declining, but PHP server-side language ran on 80% of the websites in the world. 80%. Okay. They also have improved PHP, so it's faster. These are the various versions. PHP 5, this would have been the request per seconds that it can handle. 7, what is that? Over 3 times the level. And 7.3 is easily, that's probably 250-ish. So its performance has improved with later versions. Let's see here. These are showing what the various, by the way, here's one of the problems I've seen actually working on web projects over time is when you develop a site, let's say it was written in PHP version 5.6, and then you go to migrate from 5.6 to say 6, and then from 6 to 7. It is one of the worst, firsthand experience. It is one of the worst for not having good backwards compatibility. So when you take code that was written in an older version of PHP and you try to move it into like the latest version, it usually won't work. And there's usually a significant amount of coding to doctor that PHP code to get it working on the latest version. So usually that is kind of problematic for people and they don't like that. And I would agree with that. And I have some websites for my businesses that I didn't upgrade PHP and I just put a whole bunch of web application firewalls in front and on the web servers themselves to block malicious attacks because the effort it was going to take to redevelop those websites was so great that we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars in coding that would have had to be done. And it was easier just to use some free filtering software type of thing that looked for known attacks and blocked them. And that worked pretty good for quite a while. All right, so that is one thing. So let me show you the historical trends of server-side languages. So server-side languages are languages like PHP and Python that you go to a web page, the web server executes some code and gives you some response back. That's called server-side coding. And if you look at server-side coding, here's the list of them, and look at PHP and look at everybody else. Look at PHP and look at everybody else. And this is from, I think this is from 2022, July 2021. This is just last year. It hasn't changed that much in a year. So this is why right here, that is important that that PHP might be declining and there's fewer and fewer sites being developed natively on it, but probably the next 10 years, you're going to see sites running PHP. It's not going away anytime soon. 80% market saturation, not going away anytime soon. So back in July 21, it was 80. And then to July of 22, it's probably what, 78? So it went from 80% to 78% in the last year. So it is declining, but it's not dropping off a cliff. And you're going to see PHP out there. If you do any kind of cybersecurity work with somebody who's running a website, chances are good you're going to run into PHP. Okay. All right. So I wanted to show you that. Close that. Close that. So does that make sense why, while it is a language in decline, that it is valuable to know, and I'm not wasting your time by teaching you PHP? Okay. So once again, PHP is a server-side language. It runs on the web server. It does stuff programmatically and gives HTML back to the end user. And we'll actually see some code today of what that looks like. It's interpreted on the website. Who can name for me a programming language that I said was client-side? Who can name for me last night or the night before? I talked about a language that was a client-side that ran in your browser versus on the web server.
Is that JSON?
JSON is a format of data as it's stored, not JSON.
Java?
Yeah, close. Java. JavaScript. So PHP executes on a web server. JavaScript sends code to your browser and your browser executes that code. Okay, so client side versus server side. Okay. So a little history on PHP. It was originally created in 1994. It really started taking off in the late 90s, and it started getting really big in the early aughts. I would say it probably peaked around 2007 to 2010 was kind of the peak of PHP. And ever since like 2011, 2012, it's been slowly declining, but it's still 80% of the websites are running PHP. So 97, only 50,000 websites were using it. By 99, over 1 million websites were running PHP. This was an answer to my question. These two web pages are the pages I just showed you. And the LAMP environment. Remember, we talked earlier about what the LAMP environment was. That's Linux plus Apache plus MySQL plus PHP, abbreviated as LAMP. And you'll see a lot of LAMP environments out there. So 2020, it was used on over 78% of most server-side scripting of all websites. This is that same graph I was showing you from a couple of years ago, still kind of hovering that 70, 75, 80% mark. So what are some other languages that you might run into out there? ASP. I did a lot of programming back in the day in the early 2000s. One of the companies I worked for, Mark Monitor, not only was I program manager, I also wrote ASP code. And ASP is like the Microsoft's version of PHP, if you will. So ASP pages had code and HTML, and you could decide stuff and show it to them. I suspect that some of my coding is still present on Mark Monitor's website to this day. So ASP is the second most popular at 10%, and the rest are less than 5%. And the rest, Java server pages, Ruby on Rails was hugely popular about maybe 10 years ago, but not so much. Scala, JavaScript. So a lot of the stuff that you might have originally done programmatically on the server can be pushed to the client. And why would that be good? If we had something that was currently being crunched on the server and we could push it to the client, why would we want to do that?
Saves you resources.
Yeah, you can use their CPU instead of yours. You know, you put the processing load on their end to do stuff and use their computer's processor. Instead of having these massive web servers, we can have smaller web servers because we're pushing some of the crunching with JavaScript to the end user. There can be security issues with that. So
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, one of the things you need to look at is, because it's on their browser, they have the ability to do whatever they want. And if they're a malicious actor, if they look at the code in the raw and you're giving them information you shouldn't be, they could grab that and look at it, even if you have JavaScript that's supposed to not show it to them on the end user. Does that make sense? Okay. Some pros for PHP. It is open source. It's very easy to code in. It ranks right up there with Visual Basic and Python. It is very easy to code in. One of the reasons I liked it is because I was an old school Perl programmer from the late 90s, and most of the web programming I did in the first .com bubble was written in Perl, and so it was very natural for me to move from Perl to PHP. I am not a C. I can hack together a C program a little bit, but I am not like super fluent software developer extraordinaire. I'm kind of like a hack. I call it a hack and slash developer. I can take a chunk of code and I can change it a little bit and to get it to do something I want it to. But if I had to write code from scratch, page after page after page, that's a little, that's tries my patience. So I can do programming, but I'm not fluent at it. And I would argue most cybersecurity professionals kind of fall into this genre. They're a jack of all trades. And so, by the way, you guys have probably heard the term jack of all trades, master of none. That is not the full quote. I want to bring this up because this is pretty interesting. I saw this, I can't remember. I think it was on a full quote. Jack of all trades, master of none. The original version was a jack of all trades is, where's the full quote? The complete saying was, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than the master of one. A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than the master of one. And if I had to summarize a cybersecurity professional, it would be you're a jack of all trades. You need to know, and that's why you have all these different courses across this broad spectrum of knowledge, right? You have to understand networking. You got to understand encryption. You got to understand programming. You have to understand all these pieces because a good cybersecurity professional has a very broad knowledge base. Are you a master software engineer? No, but you can read code and you can figure out what it's doing, and you can probably tell if they're doing input validation to see if it could be buffer overflowed or something, right? So that is why as cybersecurity professionals, it is important for us to have this broad base. Master of all, master of none, but oftentimes better the master of one. So make sure you learn the whole one. A lot of times people abbreviate it. Okay. Other pros, it's stable and fast. It is very stable. Multi-platform, it supports just about any database out there because you have, it's called the mid-tier is your PHP servers. And they often talk to these massive databases, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, PostgreSQL, any of those, and it will talk to all of them. Has a lot of libraries that you can borrow to accomplish things, and it's pre-installed in a lot of Linux distributions. Okay, so this is the process that we go through when we request something from a PHP server. So the client's browser sends an HTTP request. It's also called the post-get request to the web server. The Apache realizes, you know what, this is PHP, and it forwards that request. It says, oh, this isn't just raw HTML. This is actually PHP. So my PHP module that I've had added to me, Mr. Apache, has to parse this and do real-time interpret. It's a runtime interpreted. So every time somebody hits the page, that code's run and interprets that page. The PHP interpreter executes it, creates the output, and sends it back. And then Apache takes that generated HTML and sends it back to the end user's browser. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so let's look at some code. I know this is what you're all waiting for. Braden's like, Troy, can you tell me about PHP forms? And I was like, we can. We're getting to that soon. I like the enthusiasm. Okay, so we got some HTML here. We have your traditional stuff that we've already looked at last week, your HTML tags, your head tags, your body tags. And then there's this little thing, and it says less than question mark PHP. And then there's some code, echo hello world. And then a close tag, which is question mark greater than. And so when this page is processed by the web server, it says, okay, I'm going to hand this off to the PHP interpreter. PHP looks through this and says, oh, I found a PHP tag. I need to execute this code and do whatever it says, and then send the output back to Apache to send to the end user. Okay, so that is how you tell what is program versus what is HTML. Here's the kicker. We can put HTML also inside the code. So I could say echo less than, table, greater than, less than, TD, I could do my rows and column table and then programmatically report some values selected from a database, echoed out. And so you don't have to do HTML like this. You can do it with like an echo command or a print command or something like that inside of the code as well. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's back up and go to a high level. And since, how many people, show of hands, how many people have dabbled in programming before? Just a little bit. 1, 2, 3, maybe 3 or 4 people. Okay. So we're going to talk about some high level concepts that are true for any programming language. And the first thing is we're going to talk about variables. So here's what I want you to think of as a variable. I don't know if this shows up or not. This is a water bottle. And so this water bottle is a container, and I can put juice or water or nuts. It doesn't have to be water. I can fill it up with nuts or grain or whatever, right? I can put whatever I want in this container. That is what a variable is. A variable is a container that can contain other things. So we can store different. So remember with our databases, we had varchars and we had ints and we had other data types for our database. The same is true for variables in a programming language. We can have a variable that is initialized or defined as storing text. We can have a variable that is initialized as storing an integer or a number. Okay. So for example, a equals 1. What type of, this is what's called an implicit define. If you don't tell it, it kind of looks at what you're doing and tries to assume what type of variable this is going to be. What kind of variable do you think the PHP interpreter is going to make $A?
Integer.
Yeah, probably an integer, right? And then $B, we slapped some quotes around it. What type of variable do you think it's going to make $B?
Would it be a string?
Yeah, it's going to be a string variable. Absolutely. Okay. So we can say things like echo, so C equals A plus B, and D equals A dot B, A dot B. And so what's going on here is it is trying to figure out what you're trying to do. Some languages, PHP isn't one of them, some languages would complain if you tried to take a string and a number and do something with them. It would say, nope, those aren't the similar variable types. We're not going to allow you to do that. PHP is very forgiving, and there's a term for it, and I think it's called loosely defined interpreter or something like that. And what it does is it says, I know this is a string and an integer. I'm going to assume that they're both strings and do something with them. So when you add them together, the integer sum, it converted B from a string to a number, and it did 1 plus 2. And it said the answer is 3. And then for D, we said, by the way, period is a concatenation operator. And what period says is take 2 strings and just munge them together. Take 2 strings and munge them together. So when we do D equals variable A period, variable B, it takes the one that's an integer. It says, I'm going to assume this is supposed to be a string because you're concatenating it. And then it took the value 2 and it munged them together and made 12. It's not doing any math. It's taking 2 strings and putting them right next to each other. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So here we have a variable assigned a value. Here we have a variable assigned some kind of mathematical process or some kind of, it's called a function to do something, and then it saves the output of that thing, whatever it did, in the other variable. So this is our first discussion about variables. Is everybody clear on what a variable is and what it contains and that main thing? Okay. So now let's talk about logical operators and if-then statements, if-then statements. So there are pretty much two big things in programming. One is an if-then statement. It says if whatever this is in the parentheses is true, then do blah, 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 blah. If-then statement. The next one that I'm not going to go heavily into tonight because I don't think you need it yet is loops, called for next loops and do while loops. And what loops are is you say for a variable that starts at 1 and goes up to 10, loop through and do this 10 times. And we're not going to talk about loops yet tonight. We're going to focus on if-then statements. And so let's look at this little snippet of code. By the way, I forgot to say, when you see $sign in PHP, 99% of the time that means it's a variable. There are very select few cases where that's not true, but you can assume in general, when you see a $sign, it's a variable. Okay. So we created a variable called a, $sign a, our variable a, and we set it equal to 1. Then we had a if-then statement. If, open parentheses, is set a, close parentheses. What this means is if the variable is defined and it exists, if $sign a exists, it will print the statement a is set. A is set. So it checks to see if that variable has a value, and we just assigned it the line before. So yeah, it's set. There's some value in it. The value is 1. So it checks to say, is this set? Is it being used? Yes. Okay, we print is set. The other thing you can do, and if you see exclamation points, that means not. Like if it was true, then you would read that as if it's not true, then do something. Okay. So here they're saying if $sign B is not set. So you guys have probably talked about this whole connotations of double negatives, right? Right. When you say you make a statement with a double negative. So if bang not is set. So if the variable is not defined is what that means. If the variable is not defined, then we print B is not set. So by doing the bang, we say, okay, we don't want to check if it's set. We want to check if it's not set. Does that make sense to everybody? An exclamation point means no or not, and it makes the reverse of whatever you're doing make the value come true, and therefore execute whatever the blah is after the if-then statement. Okay, so that is an if-then statement.
So is PHP tab-based like Python? Because I noticed there's no opening or closing curly brackets.
Right. So Perl uses curly brackets. PHP does not.
Okay.
It can, if you're trying to do something out of order, you can put parentheses around it and have it do that. But in general, like Python, where you have the open and then the close, it's not like that.
Gotcha.
Okay. So there's another string, and it's called $sign. And it's a variable of a variable. This can get a little confusing, but let's go through it. So hello equals geeks for geeks. So there's a variable, and the variable is storing the phrase geeks for geeks. Then they have this other variable that they've defined as hello. So if you echo $var, what would you get? Looking at these two lines, if you said echo $var, what would you expect as your output? It's right here, hello. We stored the word hello in $var. Now, if we move on to this concept of a $sign, a variable of a variable, we say, think of this as the variable of $sign variable. So what this would say is if you echo $sign var, it would take $sign var and say that's hello, and then you have this extra dollar, whoops, you have this extra $sign, and it would say $hello, and the value of $below is geeks for geeks. And so the output of this one is geeks for geeks. Does everybody understand that? The variable with the name of a variable in it. And this can be pretty handy. When you have a whole bunch of different variable names and you're trying to decide which one you're going to use, this is one of the ways you can do it. $sign. Okay, so here's another one. $GFG is welcome to Geeks for Geeks. The $var is GFG. If you echo the first one, $var, you get this value. If you echo $var, it first converts this and sticks a $sign in front of it, so it becomes this, and you get welcome Geeks for Geeks. Welcome to Geeks for Geeks. Okay. All right. So one of the things you use very heavily in PHP when you're working with websites is strings. And that is because what is HTML but a collection of strings, right? An HTML page is a bunch of text. So obviously being able to programmatically change that stuff is important. So if we look at a string as a sequence of characters, here they say string test, by the way, case sensitive on variable names, case sensitive on variable names. So this is a sequence of characters, and you echo string text square bracket 0 square bracket. It's treating, and we'll talk about arrays in a couple of slides here, but it's treating this string as an array of characters. And we'll talk more about, put that word array in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to it. But this would be 0. Remember, in computers, we always start counting from 0, not from 1, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If I said echo $ string test bracket 7 bracket, I would get an S, because it would be that character. The output would be the letter S. Okay. And then if you echo the entire string, of course, you get the entire, the whole string. Single quoted strings are displayed as is. So you set a string variable to single quote, I am $age years old, and then you print that, it would say, I am $age years old. So they use single quotes and double quotes differently in PHP, okay? If you said, I am $age old, it would actually interpret this $sign and put in the variable value. Okay, single quotes versus double quotes. We already talked about concatenation. Concatenation is where you take a bunch of strings and you munge them together, and it just smushes them together. So you say is space period a space period composed string, and then you print it, and it would look like that. Whoops, misclick. And then you can also add on to the string. So we have our concatenate string, which is all these. We can take that and we can tag on something else, add on another, concatenate another string to the end, and assign it to a new variable, and then that would stick it on. Notice they use single quotes here, so it does not put in these values. What would have happened if they used double quotes there? If we use double quotes on new conc.
The output would be also is a composed string, is a composed string.
Yep, exactly. It would have interpreted this and stuck in this value, and then made the change and assigned it to new conc. Exactly correct. Okay, so there's this concept of an explode function. So we have this string called sequence. We took a string, we called it sequence, and its value is A, B, C, D, E. And where this is very popular is if you had a text file that was, say, a CSV, separated values, you could use explode to break that up into chunks and take each chunk separately. So what explode does is you tell it what character is the delimiter, and it will take the variable and split it up into an array of elements, each one with the piece by the delimiter. So in this case, we took A comma B comma C comma blah blah blah. We exploded it based on the delimiter of a comma, and it broke it up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces, numbered 0 through 6, and assigned each chunk to each element. Question: what would happen if it was AA comma BB comma CC comma DD comma EE comma FF comma GG, and we exploded it with a comma? What would the output for each element be?
AA,
Yes.
BB, CC.
Yes, exactly right. It's kind of a trick question. I wanted to see if I could get you to sucker in on that one. It's correct. Anything separated by the delimiter is going to be what is put in to each of the elements of the array. So let's talk about what an array is. Okay. So let's think about a problem. We have 3 types of cars. We could create 3 variables called cars1, cars2, and cars3. But after we wrote the code, what happens if we needed 4 cars or 5 cars or 6 cars? We have to go back into the code and add cars 4, cars 5, cars, right? That's a pain in the ass. What we can do is create an array, and array is like kind of similar to a list of items. And anybody who's worked with Python knows all about lists. It's a list of items is an array, and you can keep adding values and elements to that array as needed, and you don't got to redo the code every time you add another car. Okay, so instead of doing it like cars 1, 2, and 3, we can say, here's our PHP tag, less than question mark PHP $cars equals array parentheses Volvo, BMW, Toyota. Okay, then you echo I like, and then because it's an array, you could say cars 0, cars 1, cars 2. And then that's the end of the PHP. So this gives you flexibility that the first segment of code doesn't. We're stuck if we wanted more than 3 types of cars. But down here in this code, we could have the array be 20 types of cars, and it would have been just fine with that. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, how are we doing for time? Good, we're doing good. Okay, so let's do some real world type of examples. So let's say that we want every element stored into array as an associated key with an index to retrieve it. Okay, so here in Python, this is called the dictionary. But what we can do is we can have a list with an index. What is this starting to sound like? A list with an index.
The SQL database?
A database. It sounds like a database. This is a way to store data, a big list. And you could read out of a table a list of stuff and then have an index value assigned to each of those. So we have our books, it's an array, and we say the name is the first thing. It's kind of like an array of arrays. So within the first value of the array, we have a value 0, which is the name of the book. No, these are PHP manual, Perl manual, C manual. And these are different ways to do the same thing. Okay, so we take and we can assign PHP Perl C as a list like this. We can give it value 0 and then continue on a list, or we could say 0 is this, element number 1 is that, and element number 2 is that. So these are like 3 ways of doing the same thing. Arrays with PHP are associative. So books array, PHP manuals 1, Perl manual 1, C manual 1. hash echo books Perl manual output is 1. Okay, so what this means is we could use a number as our index, or we could use the book name as the index and return a number. Vice versa. That's what remember the associative rule of multiplication is it doesn't matter which way you do the multiplication. The answer is 1 times 2 is 2 and 2 times 1 is 2. Same thing. That's the associative rule of multiplication. It's the same thing with these arrays that are indexed. You can use a name or you could use a number to do that index. Okay, now here's where we're going to introduce our first loop. We're going to introduce our first loop, and I'll talk through this and explain what a loop is, and then we'll talk through this code. Okay. So with arrays, we have an array. It has 3 elements in the array. It's PHP manual, Perl manual, and C manual. Okay. What a loop is it's just like what it sounds. This is a for next loop. This is called the for next loop. For each, I guess I should say for each loop. So for I equals 0. So we're setting the variable I to 0. Semicolon I is less than the count of books I plus plus. So let me explain this line. It's saying that start at the number 0, and as long as the count is less than the total number of books in our array, do this next line. Okay, so it's going to start at 0. The count of the books is 3. So as long as 0 is less than 3, we're going to do whatever's inside our loop. And then the last thing is we're going to increment I, boop, and we're going to add 1. Okay, so this is a for each. So we're going to start at 0. As long as 0, whatever I is less than 3. By the way, that's less than, not less than equal to, right? And then we're going to increment. So we're going to print string I plus 1, period, quote, dashed book in my library, and then the name of the book. So what this will happen, how this will be processed, is when I is 0, we'll say, what is 0 plus 1? Somebody answer that. What's 0 plus 1? Uno, 1. So it's going to print the value 1, and it's going to say first book of my library is books, $. What is our value of I currently? Did this change it? No, it did not. It's just printing it. The value is still 0. So what is, from our list, what is the value of books sub 0? What is the value of books sub 0 in this list?
PHP manual.
PHP manual. So it'd say first book of my library, colon, PHP manual. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we'll go to I equals 1. Is 1 less than 3? It is. So we're going to do this loop, and we're going to put 1 plus 1 is 2. So here's a problem. It's going to say toost, right? It's going to go number 2 dash st, toost, no such thing. It should be second, right? Toost, book of my library is books, $I is now 1, and that's going to be Perl manual. So it's going to say toost, book of my library, Perl manual. And then it will come and say I is now 2. Is 2 less than 3? Yep, it is. Okay, so that's first, book of my library is C manual, increment I. Now I is 3. Is 3 less than 3? Is 3 less than 3? No, it's equal to 3. Whoops. 3 is not less than 3. It's equal to 3. So this is not a true statement. It will not execute this line again, and it will be done with the loop. Does that make sense how a loop works? Okay. So that was a for loop. Let's do a while loop. So books equals array, PHP manual 1, Perl manual 2, C manual 3. Okay. So this is an indexed array, and we're going to do what's called a while loop. So this is a for loop, and it says initialize a variable, increment a variable, and as long as it's some condition, do it. Then the while loop says take a variable, and while the statement is true, do it. So while $item equals each, this is a very powerful command, the each command, books retrieve the items one by one. So in PHP, we can use this each argument, and it strips off one value at a time off of our array. So while the item equals a book, and when would this statement not be true? When would an item not equal a book? If we're each takes one book at a time off the list, when would that not be true?
It goes above 3.
Yes, when it goes past the third book, it will say item equals nothing. So item equals nothing is not going to be a true statement, and it won't do the next line. Okay, so this is a while loop. So we're saying while each books print item value book of my library key. Okay, so the key is this front part, and the value is the second part after this little arrow operator. So this is the key, and this is the value. So they say, we're going to take this chunk first, and the key is PHP manual, and the value is 1. PHP is the key, PHP manual is the key, the value is 1. The next time, the key will be Perl manual, the value will be 2. The next time, C manual is the key, and the value will be 3. And this is called an indexed array. In Python talks, I think they talk about dictionaries with indexing. So while this is true, it's going to say one book in my library is colon PHP manual, 2 st book in my library Perl manual, 3 book in my library C manual. Does that make sense to everybody?
And you don't have to start with 0, right? That's why one's assigned to PHP manual.
No, you don't have to start with 0. Why? Because we are taking this item and we're setting this item to each chunk of this indexed array. So the item the first time through is a key value pair. The key is the name of the book. The value is the thing to the right of that arrow operator. Okay. So item is actually this key value pair. Does that make sense? Is anybody lost? Does this make sense?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
I think it's coming along pretty good though.
I think the best way is to talk through it, and then you guys will get to practice some of this stuff when you're working with PHP. Okay. Each and list. So while list the value and the key for each books. Okay, so we're using the same books with a key value pair, and we're taking each and we're splitting it here, and we're saying it's a list of a value and a list of a key. This while loop does the exact same as this while loop. It's a different way of doing the exact same thing. Okay. So they took the key value pair, they split it, they assigned the first part to the value, the second part to the key, and then they print value, which is 1. So once book of my library is PHP manual. So 2 different ways to do the exact same thing. And that's what you'll run into with programming. And one of my pet peeves in programming, especially in data science, is these guru data scientists will take a block of code that's usually this long and they'll turn it into 1 line. And you got to be able to read that sucker, and you're like, and they're using so many abbreviations and shortcuts and stuff that it makes it really hard to read. And I was told by my data science professor that you lose cool points if you don't learn how to like mush it down into as short of code as possible. I personally like to write code so I can go back and read it and understand what the hell it is and what the hell it does. So I'm here to tell you there is no brownie points for this class for trying to make your code as short as possible. Make your code work. That's all I care about. All right. Okay, so the list operator collects the 2 elements retrieved by each and stores them in 2 different variables right here. Okay. All right, so here we go. Multi-dimensional arrays. Multi-dimensional arrays. Okay, so now we have the books array, and it is going to contain an array of arrays, an array of arrays. So the first element in books is actually an array in its own right. So it's an array of arrays. So our books has 1, 2, 3 elements, and each one of the elements is another array with 1, 2, 3 values, 3 indexed values. So the key value pair for the first element of the array, that is element 0, the title is PHP manual, the editor is X, and the author is A. And those would probably, in a real world scenario, those would be names, right? Can you see where this would be very powerful when you're loading data from a database table into some kind of variable to manipulate that information? You see where we could say that our row, the column name is like this, and here is the value, column name, the value, column name, the value. And now we have this really cool arrays of arrays that is basically our table from a database, and each value in that row is one of the columns. Does that make sense, what I just said? Each one of these lines, picture it as a record in a database, and each one of these key value pairs is one of the values in that table for that column, for that row. So this is used when working with a lot of database stuff. Okay. So we talked about a loop, and we talked about how that works, and we're going to do a count of books. So what is our count of our books? We have an array of array. If we count that, what do you think the count is going to be of that? What do you think?
Just 3 books.
3 what? 3 3 arrays of books, right? We have an array of arrays. So we have the first thing is array of 3 of is an array of a title, an editor, and an author. And then the second one would be 3 key value pairs of a title, an editor, and an author. Does that make sense? So once again, it would say zeroth. The first time through is it's going to say zeroth book, and it will be the title. So see how they have to address each one of these? Because it's an array of arrays, you have to say that first element of the array is 3 key value pairs, and you have to tell it which one of those key value pairs you want. So we say books 0, which is this top line, and then we want the next index, which is title, and that would be PHP manual. And then we're adding the string author. So it would say 0th book, title, PHP manual, author, and it would say A. So it'd say books 0, author. This evaluates to the value for that key value pairs, So this would say 0th book, the title is PHP manual, author is A. Okay. /n. When you're working in the world of Unix or Linux, that is a line feed. So when you print \n, let me get it right. It looks like this on your camera. \n, that takes you down to a new line. It's like hitting that line feed on an old style typewriter that returns it to the beginning of the next line. So when we print this /n, it's the same in HTML as a BR. However, what's our output? Is our output to a screen, or is our output to a web browser?
Web browser.
Right. So if you do a /n and then you view it and you have a bunch of line feeds, it's going to be all one big long line because a browser doesn't know what a \n is. If you're printing it to your monitor in a program, it would look fine. But to a web browser, instead of \n, you probably are going to do BR and a \n. So the BR says that tells a line feed to your browser, and the \n will make it do a line feed so that if you're viewing it not in a browser, it would look kind of good too. Okay. All right. So how are we doing for time? Do we need a 5-minute break, or do you want to push through? I think we got maybe another 15, 20 minutes. And then that's all I'll have for you. So do you want to take a break, or do you want to just keep going? Does that mean like you're in a loop, you're stuck in a loop and you can't control C it?
Oh, I'm fine with just going on.
Okay.
I vote keep going.
Okay, we'll keep going. If you need a bio break, feel free to step away and take a bio break. Okay, so here's some case studies. This is just to get you thinking about how to apply what you just learned to real world situations, okay? That's what a case study is. So you need to build one or more web pages to manage your library, but you have no time or no knowledge on how to plan and design a database. You have no time or knowledge on how to install a free database, and the database to implement is small, only a few thousand entries, but depends on the server configuration. So let's look at how we do that. Okay, so we have a very small text file, and then we're going to call that a database. It has values stored in it, and it's tab delimited. We've already talked about CSV, common separated values. You can also have tab delimited data. And here is a text file with 3 lines. It has this, 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 and this, each one. And maybe these are like how many pages are in the book or something like that. And so these are tab delimited. So we're going to create a program. We're not going to use a database. There's only freaking 12 values here. Why create a database for 12 values? Well, the answer is because you're probably going to grow it and have a lot more than 12 down the road. But in this simple example, we're going to say we don't want a database. Let's just load it in from a flat file and process it. By the way, this harkens back to the old days of mainframe computers. Mainframe computers kept their databases, quote unquote, and these massive flat files that were delimited with like tabs and commas. And that was the data. It's in this big flat text file. So this used to be very applicable. Not so much anymore. We got modern relational databases. So our code is this. We're going to create a books, and we're going to use this PHP file command to read this text file that you see up here from this directory, and we're going to load that file into books. Okay. Then we're going to loop through. How many lines do we got there? 3 lines. Okay, so we're going to loop through our books, and we're going to say start with 0, and as long as we're less than the count of our books, which is 3, we're going to do this. Books array explode \t. Remember I said \n was a line feed? \t is a tab. And that is code for what a tab is. So we already learned what an explode is. What does explode do?
Doesn't it just like list out everything like?
It breaks it. It delimits a line of text into chunks based on the delimiter. So the first line is PHP manual tab X, tab A, tab 330. So we explode on tabs. We're looking at line 0, and into this books underscore array 0, we're going to have an array. So we're creating an array of arrays, and the first value of our array has 4 elements. It has PHP manual X, A, and 330 in it. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So the first loop here, this for next loop, took our input, exploded it, and saved it into an array of arrays. Now we're going to loop through that array of arrays, and we're going to do stuff. We're going to print stuff. So now we have our array of arrays called books underscore array, and we're going to do a loop, and we're going to go the count of the books in the array. Okay. The count of books array, this is still going to be 3, right? So we're going to say 0th book title, the 0th element of our arrays and arrays, and the key for that key value pair is title. So this would be what? This chunk right here that says books arrays String I is 0, title. From our table at the top, what is the value for that?
PHP manual.
Yes. I believe so. And the thing they're not showing you is I think there's got to be a header there that tells you the title. Okay. And then book 0 author is the next one. Book 0 editor is A. And then we're not doing anything with this. And then we're tacking on a BR, which is a line feed for a browser. Line feed for a browser. Okay. All right, here's another case study. Using functions, it's possible to write more generic code. So let me talk really quickly about a function. By the way, we only have a handful more of slides, like maybe 3 or 4. So what a function is let's say you're going to do the same thing over and over and over. Instead of repeating that code in your code over and over and over, we can create something called a function and give it a name that does something. And then in our code, we keep calling back to that function to do whatever it is we need to do. Okay, that's called the function. It's called the function. So we can write more generic code and allows us to reuse it over and over and over to add features. So here is the same code using for the same project. Always try to write reusable code. It will work for a short time on project for new projects. We load in our flat file. We create book table fields. That's our array right here, and it gives it the title, author, editor, and pages. Oh, and by the way, that was the number of pages apparently. And to our table files, we can add a new key value pair of users. So what this is doing is we have our title, author, editor, and pages. And let's say we have a user that uses that book or something. Somebody who checks the book out is the user. We can add a new key value pair. Think of it as like a column in a database. And it has a list of users that it's going to pull from this flat file. I don't like that example as much. Okay. So here's code that will go through and print out all the books in the database. So we have our library.txt. We're looping through it. We're exploding it on a tab. And then we're looping through it and printing information about each one of the books. A way to reuse code. Okay. Okay, so here's where we're talking about the functions. So instead of using that code over and over and over, and this is the last slide I'm going to go over tonight. I'm not going to get into there. I have some more slides. They're in the slide deck on Blackboard that talks about object-oriented programming with PHP. You guys don't need to know that or use it for the purposes of this class. It's kind of like an enhanced form of a function. You have these objects and you can reuse the objects over and over. The nice thing about coding with an object-oriented language is that once you learn how to do it, you can code super fast. The problem with object-oriented languages is the learning curve is incredibly steep because you got to learn all these objects and know what they do in order to use them. And that was the problem I always had. I was a very good functional, writing functions and programming. As soon as you get to object-oriented, the learning curve is so steep. I never really picked an object-oriented language that I liked. I dabbled at it a little bit with like C#, but I'm not an object-oriented. That's not to say they're bad. It's just not my cup of tea. Okay. All right. So a function can take something that you're doing and you can do it over and over and over again. So going back to our example, we could have a retrieve function that said, okay, retrieve lib. We name the function retrieve lib. And when we called it, it returns us a variable that explodes this file, that explodes the book, the flat file explodes it, sticks it in a variable and passes you back the variable. And so you could call that multiple times with multiple different files and it will do it. When you work with Python, There is tons of functions that have been developed by other developers. Same with PHP. That if there's something you're thinking of doing, there's probably a PHP function to already do it. There's one to parse CSV files. I'm here to tell you, you don't probably need to do this explode, comma, delimited thing from scratch. There are PHP functions to read in and load a CSV file already written. And those are just under the hood, they're all functions. Somebody like read underscore CSV, they wrote it, and it's a standard library that's attached to PHP. And that is all I really wanted to say about functions. And the concept is anything you find yourself doing over and over and over again, throw it in a function and reuse that function. You don't got to do that for class. This is just kind of like a little extra salt on the for flavoring. Okay. I won't go into a lot into object-oriented. There's these concepts and I'm not going to teach you object-oriented programming. So I kind of skipped that part of it because you don't need to do it for this assignment. If you ever get into programming, you'll probably learn about inheritance and polymorphism and all that, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to teach you. So, okay. So let me stop sharing. That is all I wanted to get through tonight. I wanted to give you the intro to PHP. Tomorrow night, we're going to take what we learned tonight. We're going to take this concept of code and we're going to teach you about forms. And we'll talk about how to use a form, what a form is, submitting data back to a website via form, and how that can come in handy. And you guys are going to create a PHP backed form that takes input from a user and saves those values in a database. Okay. That is the assignment for next week, not this week. That's next week's assignment. We're just kind of getting ahead of the game so that we can do that and talk about bash scripting, because that's very popular for cybersecurity too, knowing how to do bash scripting. Okay, so this week, what do you got to do? Your MySQL database, your CARS database, 2 tables, and the lines that you use to create the T-Tailor user, and assign grant the privileges and flush the database. Flush it like a piece of dirty toilet paper. Okay.
Hey, we're only flushing you. You're a user because of you.
So I think I mentioned before that I get treatments for my RA, and I'm going back to, I was taking self-injections where you inject yourself, and I'm going, starting Friday, I go back and via IV. They're giving me back into the IV. And so they get you hooked up, and after they give you the medication, they flush it with like saline to flush all the medicine into your body so that none remains in the little tube. And she was like, time for your flush. And I was like, I always go like a piece of dirty toilet paper. And they always laugh at that one. They think that's pretty damn funny.
Please tell me you're not doing this at the VA.
I am.
You are?
That's great. You got to have some fun.
Yes.
Have some fun.
Especially there.
Well, I do it at the VA because these drugs are stupid ridiculous. One of the drugs I was on, after my copay, they wanted like another $2,000 a month after my insurance copay. And I have really good insurance through CWI. I'm going to miss it because I'm going to be seen at the VA mostly. But yeah, that was, and before the insurance, it was like $5,000 a month. How can people afford these drugs? It's insane. That's why I go to the VA, because it costs me $0 when I get it done through the VA. So
I would have probably bled out if it wasn't for the VA and Brian.
Right. You got to be kind of selective. Know what they're good at and what they're not. All right. So let me stop recording here.